For a long time, and for reasons unknown, Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus remained in Soviet captivity. He was interned in numerous prisoner of war camps. With the exception of an unworthy scene that took place in the first camp, he was treated correctly, too correctly, considering that he was in Russian hands, quite unlike the treatment received by the other soldiers and officers of the Sixth Army. Hitler had begun the war against the Soviet Union as an ideological struggle, and the Russians responded with the same weapon. It is well known that in all prisoner of war camps of totalitarian powers, the victor seeks to win over the defeated to his own way of thinking, and that among prisoners the psychological shock produced by defeat manifests itself in a change of political ideology. This thesis applies equally to Germans in Soviet prisoner of war camps, to Allied troops, for example, the Romanians, the Lascar case, as well as to Russian officers and soldiers in National Socialist camps, the case of General Andrei Andreevich Vlasov. With regard to former German officers, it must be recalled that within the officer corps, the rift between the traditional and the revolutionary had never fully healed. When defeat began to take shape under a regime that was becoming increasingly arbitrary under Hitler, that old wound reopened, and, in an invisible way, within the Soviet camps the mysterious power of Hitler continued to provoke new conflicts. Senior officers of the Sixth Army, above all General von Seydlitz, founded, in the summer of 1943, in collaboration with German communists who had emigrated to the Soviet Union, the Association of German Officers within the National Committee for a Free Germany. Whatever the attitude of the Soviet government toward this committee, whether it regarded it genuinely as an ideologically kindred association in the event that Germany should end the war prematurely and Hitler be overthrown, or merely as an auxiliary force, many German officers allowed themselves to be won over by the idea of creating a unified front for the establishment of a new order in Germany. It was a utopia, like the idea that then prevailed in European resistance movements, of a united anti-fascist front between the right and the left, an idea that quickly evaporated in practice. Field Marshal Paulus, despite being continually courted by the Russians, hesitated for a long time before deciding to collaborate with the National Committee. He asked himself whether his political activities among prisoners of war would lead to anything positive. But at the end of July, and the beginning of August 1944, when he received the first news of 20 July, when he learned that in the homeland old comrades and friends, Field Marshal von Witzleben, Colonel General Huppner, General Felgebel, had indeed attempted to rise up against Hitler to overthrow his regime, when he learned of the deed of von Stauffenberg, whom he knew very well, having served under him in the organization section of the General Staff, he then took the decisive step. On August 8, 1944, when in Berlin Witzleben and Huppner were brought before the court, sentenced to death and executed, Paulus attempted to issue an appeal to the German armies in the East. In the homeland, the Gestapo arrested members of his family. It was too late. For the Soviet command, military victory was now only a matter of time. It no longer needed an alliance with the National Committee. For Paulus, however, something more was at stake. He had always been a deep and meticulous thinker, always striving to distinguish between truth and falsehood. Now that the true face of the Hitler regime was being clearly revealed to him, he began to ask himself whether the military action launched against the Soviet Union had been justified. He came to the conclusion that the Germans had committed a tremendous injustice, a violation of international law, and he felt personally responsible, since he had closely collaborated in those plans of attack. And because he felt guilty, he did not refuse to appear when the Russian prosecutor in the trial of the war criminals at Nuremberg summoned him as a witness against the leaders of the high command of the Wehrmacht. Another factor was added to this. In his own person, he had experienced the collapse of the once vaunted esprit de corps of the officer corps. For Hitler, for the Wehrmacht command and the state leadership, the generals, officers, and soldiers of the Sixth Army had died when they were taken prisoner. They were no longer spoken of. It could not be admitted that the army led by Hitler had lost battles against the Bolsheviks. Generals who lost a battle suffered severe punishment. All of this caused Paulus deep bitterness, since he was convinced that he had fulfilled his duty, and now no one rose to defend him. A man like him, who as a responsible commander-in-chief had always weighed his decisions so carefully, could not now take them lightly. For Paulus, this was not a conversion to communism as a way of life, but rather a political and military transformation, both for himself and for the entire German people, and he sincerely believed in this. He believed that the political reorganization of Germany was possible only in cooperation with the Soviet Union. He chose the East over Western democracy. He remained steadfast in this attitude, even after he was released by the Russians. He established his residence in Dresden and became a respected guest of the German Democratic Republic, though under the surveillance of officials of the SED. Elena Constance Paulus died in 1949 in Baden-Baden. She never saw her husband again. Paulus did not enjoy many years of life in his comfortable exile in Dresden. In 1955, he fell ill with a certain organic disease of the brain that caused paralysis of all his muscles, though without impairing his intellectual clarity. The doctors declared themselves powerless to combat this illness, which caused the Field Marshal's death in 1957 in Dresden. During his final days, he demonstrated the same firmness and serenity that had always characterized his military career, even in the most critical hours when his fate was already sealed.